Thank you, Anna. And thank you to all the organizers and my colleagues for inviting me to share a global perspective on what we call financial capability. And I think definitions and language vary from country to country. In our circumstance, we refer to financial capability in many ways as an aspirational state, where a client is ultimately empowered to behave in a more responsible way, to accumulate assets, to have an economic security blanket. So that's, for today, you can consider financial capability and financial education and financial literacy to be all one phrase. But I really want to emphasize three key points today. We've had a wonderful set of presentations and discussions from the context here in Russia, where I think there's great leadership over the past few years in focusing on the value of financial education. Obviously, the work that Floran and our colleagues are doing at OECD to look at the global perspective and helping national governments think about this. To a degree, I'm going to talk a bit more about that perspective blending with providers, where this middle ground is. How do we have national frameworks, national policies, and how do we work in an aligned way with providers to actually implement them? In our experience, we spend more time making grand investments with our partners who are implementing programs, not setting national policies. So I want to talk a bit about that, and I hope the clicker works. Oh, actually went too well. Again, if you can remember three things from this presentation, this is the slide you should pay attention to. After this slide, you can go back to your BlackBerries or your iPhones or your Droids or whatever technology that we use here. Fundamentally, I think we all have discussed today, and we would agree, and you'll be hearing over the rest of the day, that client empowerment or financial capability really is a critical element of economic security and ultimately responsible finance. You can put certain recourse mechanisms in place and client protection and elements of right products and whatnot, but a client that knows or consumer that knows what's best for them is a safeguard. And if you have an entire population, particularly starting with young people, who know what's best for them and what their needs are, ultimately you'll benefit in the long run. I do want to talk about, and I don't know if this translates into Russian, the concept of a North Star, a central point where we can focus between policy creation and regulation, and also incentives for providers to act responsibly so that they're mitigating risk and actually realizing financial benefit. And I actually do believe that this is possible, being respectful of course, nefarious marketing that does occur, as we know. And to my last point, there is an opportunity. We see a lot of increasing evidence, and we'll talk about this in the next panel session, of products that have been designed, services that are being provided that will meet individual consumer needs, whether you're a pensioner or you're a young person emerging into the workplace, that benefit them, but that also can actually be sustainable to the provider. Because there's great risk of policies, recommendations, mandates that say providers have to do certain things, but there's no sustainable economic way to actually implement them. That the challenge lies in between. How do we ensure that the financial service providers can do this without bankrupting them? Because ultimately many of them are businesses. Yet, how do we have them operate in a more responsible manner so that they meet the national mandates of these governments? So these are the three key points that I'll talk just a bit more about. I'm very impressed with all the progress that we've made. For many years, as Floran knows, many of us have been sort of shouting in the wilderness that this is really important, and I think the governments have been far ahead of providers in how valuable and necessary this information is and these approaches are. I think we actually are starting to see change. We obviously have a tremendous amount of progress from a policy, regulatory standpoint, but we're also starting to see from a provider standpoint a lot of alignment, organization, coordination, and understanding of the value of this approach. Just a couple of key points that I'd like to focus on. Increasingly, I think, and I think Floran referenced this, as did some of the other speakers, some of these policies are actually adjusting a bit as we better understand outcomes. And I think that that's important as we think about from national financial education strategies. What we thought about and what we're learning need to adjust and be calibrated against each other. And I think we're seeing more and more of an evidence-based approach to our policymaking and regulation. One of the things that we certainly understand and value is the two sides of the coin, so to speak, between client protection and financial education. And I think we have programs increasingly that work in tandem with one another. CGAP is doing more and more work in this regard. And I think what's exciting in many ways is that we have more and more evidence of what's working and what's not. We have more to do, but here's obviously a bit of a list of measurement, and there's some others that we've heard today, piece of being one. The Global Findex, for those of you not familiar, is a program of the World Bank, financial index measuring, I forget 10 million, I forget how many people globally, but it's an astronomical number supported by the Gates Foundation and Gallup. Obviously, the work of the Russia Trust Fund and the UK government, DFID, has done some work in this regard in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have a program with one of our NGO partners, IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, to basically measure, to understand what's working. Because you can have policy, it may seem good at the surface, but if we don't know that it's benefiting anybody, what good is that policy? So I think we're all recognizing the value of investing in that research, and the gathering of evidence to make better policy, which in turn will have providers ultimately operating more responsibly and more effectively for your clients' benefit. And as you can see at the bottom, I really fundamentally think, and my colleagues at Citi Foundation, and I think a lot of our partners see that we're really at a tipping point or an inflection point where providers and policymakers and regulators are starting to align. However, I think we have a little more work to do. We talked before, I mentioned all the work that
Я говорил о том, что мы работаем активно с OECD, а также с глобальной программой по финансовому включению вашей двадцатки. Работа идет неравномерно. Некоторые страны продвинулись дальше, чем другие. Но в целом идет процесс тестировки тех программ. Без этого мы не могли бы организовать совместную работу. Проблема для многих регуляторов состоит в том, чтобы найти партнеров для переговоров, с кем говорить. Есть большое количество организаций, все мы можем собраться, но кто отвечает, например, за реализацию этих программ в конкретном регионе? Последние пару лет стало появляться больше организаций, особенно в том, что касается неправительственных организаций, программ финансового включения 2020, например. Это глобальная программа по финансовому включению в данную программу к 2020 году. Тут есть большое количество участников. 5 основных элементов включено в эту программу. Один из них – это, в общем, некая схема, структура, которая обеспечивает возможность добиться полного финансового включения. Мне кажется, что прорывом является принятие финансовых возможностей. Мы говорим о доступе. Доступ сам по себе не решает проблемы. Собственно, создает часто больше рисков. Когда имеется баланс, то в этом случае можно получить более сбалансированный подход. Я думаю, что конвергенция правил и регулирующих норм дает возможность получить положительные перемены. На что все это похоже? Надеюсь, что вы видите на экране. Написано это 5 принципов финансового включения в процессе 2020. Это финансовые возможности, потребности клиента, технологии. Изначально все было направлено на микрофинансы. Сейчас все воспринимается в более широком контексте. Многие из присутствующих здесь задействованы в этой программе. Я хочу сказать, что вопрос баланса, доступ, спрос, инфраструктуры является критическим для того, чтобы финансовые услуги были предоставлены в наиболее ответственном ключе. Если посмотреть на 5 категорий, то вы видите, что Финансовая грамотность, финансовое образование — это ключевые столпы, так сказать. Но кроме этого, нужно лучше понимать, что нужно клиентам. И я об этом буду говорить более подробно. Каждому человеку нужны разные вещи в разные этапы его жизни. И соответственно, нужна соответствующая структура. Что мне нужно сегодня? Может быть, через 20 лет мне будет нужно что-то совсем другое. Я не знаю, что мне понадобится через 20 лет, но понимание этого критически важно. И таким образом мы стараемся работать. Такие группы, как СЕГЭП, например, хорошо продвинулись в этом направлении. Роль технологии также активно увеличивается. Мы должны принять этот факт. Технология сегодня является центральной платформой, на которой предоставляются финансовые услуги, особенно там, где нет особой инфраструктуры. Отчетность, кредитная отчетность — это также часть инфраструктурного, так сказать, контекста, и, с другой стороны, это относится к защите клиентов. Я надеюсь, что регуляторы сейчас выделяют этого некое направление работы, и они работают над тем, чтобы наиболее эффективно добиться установления понимания по этому вопросу. Итак, можем ли мы создать вместе некую полярную звезду, некую диодную звезду? Есть многое, что можно сделать в совместных программах. Как создать диалог между теми, кто осуществляет регулирование, и теми, кто представляет услуги? Можем ли мы увязать интересы и стимулы? Естественно, есть общие интересы. В том, что касается финансовых организаций, то они стремятся работать качественно и при этом работать в условиях стабильности. Как можно создать стимулы для тех финансовых организаций, которые могут снижать риски, например, не допуская чрезвычайной задолженности у своих клиентов? Я думаю, что нужно здесь связывать разные аспекты работы. Использование счетов. Чего мы не знаем с точки зрения финансовых организаций, это то, каковы цели и задачи, они должны еще быть выработаны. Куда надо двигаться? Что означает успех? Как мы его определяем с точки зрения финансовой организации? Как мы его видим? Как мы определяем баланс? Как мы можем сказать, что будет эффективно, что нет? Защита клиента. Является ли это мерилом успеха? Не знаю. Нужно лучше понять этот вопрос. Или, например, баланс сбережений. В некоторых странах люди сбережений вообще людей нет. Страхование. Можем мы считать, что наличие страхования является признаком высокой степени развития или нет. Это также вопрос, который активно обсуждается. Есть много способов измерить знаем,
there are different needs for different people at different times. And the challenge, of course, for providers and also policymakers and regulators is how do you create a framework that addresses everybody's needs at those different points. And the challenge is, you can look at a place like Asia, for instance, where you have fundamental issues of access to financial products and services. But also you have very advanced economies with aging populations that need better benefits and knowledge around pensions and insurance. And as governments and providers, particularly providers that work across markets, how do you address that from a business profile, business model? It's a big challenge, and I think we have a lot more to learn. And then fundamentally, I think we have to talk a bit about, and we'll learn in this next session about evidence. How does evidence influence and inform not only national policies, but also how providers operate and how providers act? This is a really, I think, fantastic schematic, which I wish I could claim credit for. I've thought a lot about it, but our colleague Elizabeth Ryan, who works at the Center for Financial Inclusion at Axiom, put this together. And it references my comment earlier about everybody needs a different product or service at a different time in their lives. And I think, as you can see, going from left to right, and we're talking obviously about young people today, what they need is very different than what they need as a middle-aged adult with a young family, obviously maybe starting or trying to run a business, start saving for the future. And a lot of the economies we're not familiar with, there are no guaranteed schemes for retirement. Increasingly not, which is a challenge. How do you save enough? How do you protect your family as we get older? And obviously, the more that we become mature and older and wiser, I'd like to believe, we have a different needs at that particular time. But as a provider, and I think you can create policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks around this reasonably well, but as a provider, how do you develop products and services that meet this framework in an economically viable way? It's an enormous challenge. And so what I think we see a lot of are what I would say are monolithic products that are a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's an enormous challenge because it doesn't necessarily meet individuals' financial needs, particularly as they change over time. So what I really want you to remember about this framework is that it's pretty complex. And I'd actually argue that it's in many ways three-dimensional. But it gives you a sense of, and if you would think about an arc of your experience that goes through this process, how do you design financial products and services as a provider that can help evolve over the course of your life? And it's very challenging, but I'm hopeful that we can. Because despite all of these changes and the population changing dramatically, I fundamentally think that there will be more access, as I talked about the role of technology, increasingly more and more the ubiquity of technology, the provision of financial services through that technology will fundamentally reduce the cost of the provision of this service. So the ability to think in a more customized way is actually, I believe, more feasible as time goes on. I think we're still a long ways away from that. I think you're starting to see integration of products and services across sector, across industry, where health and education and financial services are in many ways packaged as one. We're seeing this in certain economies more than others, but ultimately I think we're going to see more of that. Ultimately, it's about platforms in many ways. And what's, I think, really exciting and a bit scary is the role of technology to collect data and how we behave and how do we operate as rational or irrational beings. And we'll hear a bit more about this next, but I think the role of what we call big data and understanding human behavior and patterns will really help to influence and inform providers in a cost-effective way so that they can develop products and services that are economically viable and yet responsible. And I believe that's in my presentation, so thank you very much.